All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Right. So my name is Prasanta Bhattacharya, and once again, let me first begin by thanking all of you for joining us for this session today. So I'm a research scientist with the Institute of High Performance Computing in Singapore. I'm also an adjunct faculty at the NUS Business School. And so I work with network science and graph analytics problems a lot. And so for this session, I'll be joined by Andras and Fai, so who are representing Lynx Analytics. And so towards the later part of the session, you'll be hearing from them. So the plan for this evening is to sort of structure this talk into like 4 broad categories. For the first 2 categories that I'll be talking about, I plan to give all of you kind of a flavor of what network science really allows or affords you to do. And for some of you for whom this might be like the first talk that you're attending on graphs or networks, you should find some of the basics and the terminologies that I'm going to introduce to be particularly helpful. For others who are more familiar with doing network science projects or graph analytics problems, some of this might feel a little repetitive towards the beginning. So you could try to be patient. So I'll come to the more applications and some of the more specific research problems that I'm working on towards the later part of my talk. And then for the next two sessions, I'm going to pass it on to Andras and Fai, who are going to walk you through a live example using Lynx Guide, which is a graph analytics platform. And you're going to see how you can take a real world example, construct a network, and then try to derive insights that can have some kind of business value in the finance industry. So one question to begin with that I keep getting from time to time is what really interests me about network science, right? So I've been working in this field for many years now, and I could tell you a lot of different aspects about graphs and networks that I find particularly exciting. But if I have to summarize it into one key point, it's the fact that the graphical representation of data lets you see existing phenomena or contexts in a very different light. Okay, so let me give you a fun example of what I mean. So some of these images on this slide might seem familiar to you, especially if you're a Game of Thrones fan. If you notice this network, it's actually a network of Game of Thrones characters. And the way this network is constructed is this is essentially a betrayal network. So what this means is every node in this network is a character from Game of Thrones. And if character A betrays character B in some episode in some season, you see a link between them, like a directed arrow from A to B, all right? And so the links are weighted based on the impact of the betrayal. So if someone kills the other person, so you'd see a very thick and bold link. If it's just some maybe lying or cheating, you'd see a thinner link. What's also interesting is that you notice that some nodes are bigger than others, and that's because the nodes are weighted in terms of their degree. So what this means is the nodes are larger in size proportional to the number of betrayals that they have either perpetrated or been a victim of. That's why you see someone like Cersei Lannister, for instance, is a really large circle because she's always in the thick of things when it comes to betrayals. And what's also interesting is you'd notice that there are some links that are bold, but there are other links that are dashed, right? And so what the dashed links indicate are implied betrayals. So these are betrayals that have not been proven, but they're sort of like being suspected. And so this has actually been constructed by observing the first 5 or 6 seasons of Game of Thrones. And again, if you've been living under a rock, you haven't been following Game of Thrones, just by looking at this network, you can get a very kind of like a bird's eye view of who are the main characters, what's like the plot and the dynamic between these characters, even without getting into some of the details, right? So there's a fun example of how you can see a very non-traditional context from using a network lens that gives you some quick insights. Right, so this is some slightly different context, but this is actually from a published paper from way back in 2011. So researchers, they actually analyzed over 50,000 recipes from around the world to understand whether ingredients that commonly co-occur in a particular recipe share flavor compounds. So that was what the paper was about. But I just picked this one particular network to kind of emphasize a certain point. So if you look at this network, a node in this network is a food ingredient, right, that you use while cooking. And there's a link between two nodes if the ingredients co-occur in a particular recipe. Now, once again, I mean, this is just a simple visualization, but if you just by looking at this network diagram, you will be able to see clusters emerging that correlate with certain geographic communities or cultures. So for instance, you would see that there are some ingredients that are almost specific to certain cultures, like for example, cream. You can see cream is very popular in Western European and North American cuisines, but almost absent in, say, East Asian cuisine. And they also see there are certain ingredients that are crossover ingredients that are common to multiple cultures, like garlic or tomatoes. And so again, the point of showing you this is to emphasize that you don't have to be a culinary science expert or a food network expert, but just by looking at a simple network visualization, you could quickly test and answer certain key hypotheses about how people around the world cook and eat food. Right? Finally, and I think since we're in the middle of a global pandemic, I thought it might be interesting to point out that networks also serve as very important public health sensors. So the plots that you see on the screen were actually taken from a study that was conducted in 2009 when there was a particularly bad case of the H1N1 flu in the US. And so this is a network of students from Harvard University. And what the researchers basically showed were two things. First, they pointed out that if you had systematic data about social networks of students, you would notice that the more central nodes in the network, and I'll talk about centrality in a little bit, but for now, think about nodes of students who are important in some sense, like maybe popular students within a student community. So central nodes have a higher probability of getting infected first. So that was the first insight. And subsequently, they were able to forecast or predict the spread of the disease through the network of these individuals quicker than, say, a randomly picked sample from the broader population. So they were able to show how just by monitoring this student network within a college, they were actually able to predict the peak incidence of this particular disease almost 2 weeks ahead of the general population. All right. So again, this is a very classic example of what you can achieve in public health if you manage to get hold of systematic data on social networks. And this actually, if you think about it, forms the basis of a lot of things like contact tracing that you see today that's happening in so many countries. All right, so now that I've sort of given you like a quick overviews of how popular use cases of how networks are used in very different contexts, let me quickly run you through some very basics of how do you go about even thinking about networks in terms of a data structure, right? How do you even create your first network? And I think, again, this should be of more interest if you're completely unfamiliar with graphs or networks. And if you've already been working with graphical data, then, I mean, you could probably find this a bit repetitive, but please bear with me. All right, so very simply put, a network is a collection of nodes and links, okay? And so the nodes could be one of many things, right? So a popular understanding of social networks is that it's a network of individuals or people in society. But that's only one particular use case of social networks. You can think of nodes as products or entities, organizations, countries, train stations in a subway, for example, right? All of these things can be modeled as networks. And then once you have the nodes, the relationships between these nodes can capture different aspects of the network. So for example, in a social network, the links could be friendship, familial ties, kinship, it can be romantic relationships, academic collaborations, co-authors, etc. So one benefit of constructing a network is that it lets you answer predictive problems. So consider the social network that you see on the screen. If you're given this network, you can actually try to ask questions that are predictive in nature. Like, okay, given this network, who is Alice going to befriend next? Okay. You can also answer questions about explanation. So given that Alice and Charlie or Alice and Bob are friends in this network, what reasons do you think attributed to that friendship? Like, why did they become friends? So that's a question about explanation. So you can answer both predictive and explanatory questions given a certain network. So this is a use case that's probably more closer to business value. So again, think about the previous network with Alice, Charlie, and Bob. And if I pose this question that, okay, given that Alice buys the latest model of an iPhone, what is the likelihood that Bob, being a friend of Alice, will buy it too? So this is actually a network effects question, right? The other way of framing this problem is, if you do observe that Bob buys an iPhone a couple of weeks later, can we attribute that purchase decision to the friendship tie, to the social network, right? So this is a question of attribution. So again, these are problems that occur in many different contexts. The example that I gave you is one of product sales or product purchase. So a key implication of this is, if you do find that there is network effect in the sale of iPhones, what can retailers or product companies do to leverage this, right? So if I know that there is going to be a contagion in purchase behavior, can I seed certain key users or key customers with promotions to amplify this network effect? Or can I try to make sure that this network effect is not restricted to a particular part of the network, but spreads far and wide? So there are many things that I can do if I have some preliminary evidence of this kind of contagion. Right, so if you think about the different kinds of relationships while modeling networks, you can model graphs in terms of whether the ties are directed or undirected, right? So in the previous example with the social network of Alice and Bob and Charlie, it's a friendship network, so it's largely undirected. There's no direction. If you think about an information flow network, right? So if Alice sends a message to Bob, and Bob sends a message to Charlie, for example, and that's an example of a directed network, but there's a direction to the flow on the link. The networks can also be binary, or they can also be valued or weighted, right? So a binary network essentially means that a link either exists or doesn't exist. A valued or weighted network means that there is some idea of an edge or a link weight, right? So again, in terms of the social networks, you can think of the friendship network as being a binary network. So either you are friends or you're not friends. But if it's a communication network, like you call someone, then maybe the weight could be the volume of calls or text messages that you send a person. So in that case, it's a weighted and directed network. Okay. So how do you go about representing network data in terms of data structures? I mean, this is useful if you're thinking in terms of implementing a network, right? So the most popular data structure that's used, or at least used to be popular for representing network data, is what's called an adjacency matrix, where the two axes are essentially the nodes, and then you have a value in the cell which denotes whether there is a tie or not, right? So if you look at this matrix, if there is a link between nodes A and B, you see that you have a value of 1 in the matrix, and if there is no link, then either it is a missing value or you can have 0, depending on how you frame the matrix. Now, the problem with storing networks as adjacency matrices is it's not very space efficient, right? Especially if your network is extremely sparse, as most social networks tend to be. So if most of your possible links don't exist, then you're essentially wasting a lot of space in storing missing values. So that's why you actually have other forms of storing social networks. You could store networks in the form of an adjacency list, where you only store the edges. You can also just save it as an edge list, which again is a very popular way of storing network data. An edge list is essentially, you can think of it as just a data frame where each row essentially is an edge. And you can have additional columns to capture other attributes like the edge weight, the edge ranks, etc. Okay. Right. So given that background of what networks look like and what kind of data structures you can use to store networks, let's move on to a key concept in network science, which is about understanding network centrality. And again, depending on what area you're working on, this is potentially something that you're likely to run into, okay? So the idea of what or which node in a network is important in some sense, right, is a key question in many different fields. So what makes nodes important or influential? It depends strictly on the context, but there are certain ways of modeling network features that can help you answer these questions. So there are some non-network ways by which you can categorize nodes. So for example, you can think of demographic attributes like the age of a person or the gender of a person. That's not dependent on the network. But you can think of structural measures or network dependent measures. And that's where centrality scores are particularly useful. So popular centrality measure that, again, you're going to hear about later in this session as well, is the idea of degree centrality. And degree essentially just means the number of links a node is connected to. And if it's a directed network, you can have two different types of degree. So in degree would be the number of nodes that are kind of incident on the node. So they're basically links that end in the node. And out degree would be the number of links that flow out of the node. Okay. And so again, in the context of an adjacency matrix, you can think of out degree as kind of a row sum and in degree as kind of a column sum. Okay. So over here, you can think out degree of C would essentially be 3. So right, you have C to B, C to D, and C to E. And in degree of C would be 1 because you just have one node that's coming in, or one edge that's coming in to C from E. All right. Now you could think of other types of centrality as well. So what degree really captures as a metric is really how active or how popular a particular node is. Okay, because it just measures the number of different ties that's connected to that particular node. But what if you wanted to capture other attributes about a node? So here's another example. So the closeness centrality measure is a measure of distance of a node. So if you want to understand how close is a particular node from every other node in a network, then maybe a good metric to focus on is basically any distance-based metric, and closeness is a popular one. Okay, so closeness basically captures is a function of the distance between a particular node from every other node in the network. Okay. The other interesting metric that I wanted to just quickly introduce to you is the betweenness centrality. And again, this is a computationally very expensive metric to compute. It will take a lot of time to compute this measure, but sometimes it's a very useful measure to understand kind of like the brokerage potential of a particular node. So what betweenness really captures is, given all the shortest paths in your network, okay? So if you have, so think about the shortest path from one node to any other node in the network. So then you can think about all pairs of shortest paths between all pairs of nodes, right? And then for a given node, the betweenness would be the proportion of shortest paths that include that particular node, okay? So again, think about this particular measure, right? So what this measure is really capturing is how many shortest paths include the focal node for which you want to calculate the betweenness. Let me give you an example of where betweenness can be particularly interesting. So I don't know if you've seen this particular TV show called Indian Matchmaking on Netflix. And if you haven't seen, you could give it a skip. It's but not particularly memorable. But I just wanted to highlight that. So this is an interesting show about how this lady, who's a professional matchmaker, works with prospective candidates across US and India and tries to pair them, right? So for for marriage. And the reason why she's so powerful or effective in this kind of a business model is because if you think about this network of prospective grooms and brides, most of these shortest paths include her because she's kind of sits in the middle. And so she controls the flow of information and flow of resource in this kind of like, Indian and Indians in the US marriage market, okay? And so that's what gives her power in the network. So in terms of the metrics that I just explained to you, this would translate to someone having very high betweenness centrality. Okay. If you look at the network on the left, you'd notice that this particular node H has very high betweenness centrality. What's also interesting is you have other nodes that also have high centrality values depending on what measure you're looking at. So this is probably a key point to remember from the past couple of slides, that there is no one central node in a network or one important node. Your definition of an influencer or an important node would depend on what aspect of importance are you really focusing on. Okay, so this is what I want you guys to take away from these couple of slides. Right. So for the last couple of sessions, the slides, I'm going to talk about two broad classes of problems that you can solve with whatever you've seen so far about social networks. The first class of problems is about prediction, right? So there are two types of predictive problems that you can solve using networks. The first is about predicting links or edges on a network. So a good example of that would be all your recommendation systems on digital platforms, right? So if you're on LinkedIn and you get, friend requests or requests for connecting with others, that's being driven by a link prediction algorithm at the background, right? Think about like Tinder or dating sites. The matches that the app shows you is based on a fairly complicated link prediction problem. And depending on the choices that you make, the learning algorithm can learn and improve itself. Now, you can also think about the other kind of predictive problem on networks, which is about predicting node level attributes. So the previous problem is about predicting links. Now, the second problem is about predicting some kind of node labels. So in this case, given the network structure and other node labels, can you predict the label of a focal node? That's the problem. And later on in the session, you're going to look at an actual example of where we're going to predict stock prices of companies using network information. So that's a good example of node attribute classification. So another context where this network-based predictive models are particularly useful is in insurtech, or especially, but specifically in fraud detection in insurance. So this is an example of a collision insurance where you have two individuals who are kind of like masquerading as the driver and the victim in different applications to create fraudulent loan claims, insurance claims. And so what you can do is, if you represent this phenomena using a network of how these individuals behave as entities and how these entities are connected in different applications, you will be able to find out or uncover these cartels of fraudulent insurance claims. So this is an actual use case of how you can use these node level attribute prediction models to flag whether a claim application is fraudulent or not. All right, so the final part I just wanted to quickly leave you with is the idea of causal inference on networks. And this is something that's personally very interesting to me because a lot of my research falls into this space. The reason why causal inference on networks is a tricky problem is because so far, you've looked at how interventions on a particular person or a node changes the behavior of that particular node, right? So that's a very kind of a typical causal problem, right? Now, in the context of a network, it's slightly trickier because now you're looking at the effects of intervention or treatment on a particular node on other nodes that are linked to this node, right? So that's the network effect problem in causality. So such kind of peer influence problems exist in almost any context imaginable. So for example, you can think of contagion in the purchase of products or adoption of products. I remember the iPhone example that I told you about is a good example of this. Diffusion of innovations or even like diseases and disorders. So this is again a use case that's particularly relevant now. So how do you understand spreading processes on networks? That's a causal inference problem as well. Voting behavior is also becoming increasingly important today. There are actually papers that show how, if publicly available signals of your voting behavior can actually influence your friends, right? So there are studies now that look into those kind of contagion behavior, Right. Before I go into an actual use case of a research project that I'm working on, I just had one slide to emphasize that, you know, a conventional way of solving causal analytics problems is not straightforward on networks. So a lot of you would be using A/B testing for, you know, in many different contexts. So it's basically a way of doing randomized experiments to uh, to to come up with, you know, unbiased estimates of your intervention. That's what A/B tests do. Now the problem with doing A/B testing on networks is that when you randomize, right, you can create a lot of different problems depending on what your application is. So let me give you a simple example. So let's assume that you're a tech company that's just launched a new video player, again, an online video chat application, for example, and you're randomly doing an A/B test on your network where you've taken a pool of users to whom you've launched that product, and then you have other users to whom other users you've kept in the control group. But what happens if there's one user who has this product of doing a video chat, but none of that person's peers are in the treatment group, right? So then who's this person going to talk to? So these are practical problems that can arise when you do randomization on networks. There's also the problem of network interference. Now think about a graph, right? So it's a connected, in a connected graph, it's theoretically impossible to separate a group of nodes from a second group of nodes. So you cannot have a clean treatment control split in a connected graph. So you need to resort to statistical ways of correcting for possible transmission or spillover of the treatment across groups. And finally, how do you ensure that even if you're able to create these partitions in networks, that you're able to preserve the network structure for these two groups? And if you're not able to do that, then the change in network structure can be a confounding factor that can, you know, prevent you to estimate your actual treatment effect in an unbiased fashion. All right. So that becomes a problem. So these are just three problems that you might face if you're trying to do some kind of randomized test on networks to create causal estimates. All right. So before I hand over to Andras, I just wanted to leave you with one example of a project that I'm working on, and hopefully this is going to be of some interest to you. So this is this comes from the field of microfinance. And again, for some of you who might be familiar with this, microfinance is increasingly popular in emerging economies, especially in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, where and really helps people in countries without a more established banking and credit infrastructure, right? So people in a lot of countries need access to affordable loans or credit, but they don't necessarily have either the banking infrastructure or the necessary financials and collaterals to apply for structured loans. So this is where micro-lending and microfinance institutions come in and offer a way to secure small amounts of loans, but at reasonable interest without collaterals. So one of the problems that we were trying to investigate in collaboration with a micro-lending company in Southeast Asia is whether there is evidence of a network effect in the loan defaulting behavior. So what this means is if I take a microloan and I default on my payments, is there evidence that my immediate peers or my friends who are also users of this particular app or service, are they going to default on their loans as well? Is there evidence of that? And or rather, can that default behavior be attributed to our network tie, right? So the second order problem that we're trying to look at is if there is evidence of contagion in default behavior, can we attribute that to some individual level factor like their risk, right? The credit risk, which the companies generally assess in the financial sector. So this is like a snapshot of two different samples from the data set, just to give you a feel of what the data looks like. On the left-hand side, you see a low credit risk sample. On the right-hand side, you see a high credit risk sample. The nodes in red are nodes that have paid back successfully. The nodes in blue are nodes that have defaulted. So these are borrowers who have defaulted. The nodes in gray are nodes about whom we don't have any information. We know that these borrowers exist, but we don't have any data about them. So it's a very interesting, data context, also network context. So it's a very incomplete network, but we do have some structural information about some borrowers. Now, again, not surprisingly, you'll notice that in the high credit risk sample, there are a lot more number of defaults, right? It's a lot more of these blue nodes. And what we want to estimate is whether there is some kind of contagion in how these blue nodes default. Is it because of an initial set of defaulters that cascades into a bigger sample of defaulters, right? So without getting into the specifics, we used a variant of what's known as a network autocorrelation model. And again, if you're interested in this line of work, you can always reach out to me offline. We can have a conversation. But just to give you like a preview of some of the findings that we observed, we found that in the low credit risk sample, most of the borrowers do not show any network effects. You see a histogram that's centered around 0, roughly, right? So there's no evidence that there is a contagion effect for the low credit risk sample. Very interestingly, for the high credit risk sample, we see almost a bimodal distribution. So there's a sample of users, or borrowers rather, who show negative influence, which means if their peers default, they tend to pay back on time, and vice versa. But we also see a second group of borrowers who show positive influence effect, which means if their peers default, they tend to default as well. Now, this is very interesting because using this insight, microlending companies can both understand how default behavior percolates in a network of borrowers, but they can also potentially intervene and prevent some of these cascades from beginning or spreading, right? And this is very useful in a context like microfinance, because these are essentially small institutions that need to survive on very limited portfolio values, right? So if they see a very high loan loss rate, they might not be able to service new loans, and then the whole the system can collapse. But it's not like major banks that can sustain with relatively high loan loss rates, right? So this is a good example of where network science can come in and address a very critical problem in the financial sector. All right, so with that background, I want to hand it over to Andras, who will be walking you through a different kind of financial sector use case. In this case, we try to get stock price data for S&P 500 companies, and based on a correlation of their of a moving window of prices, we try to create a network of price mobility, where two companies which have a similar trajectory of price movements are linked. And then based on that, Andras is going to show you a visualization of these networks, how we can identify communities in this network of companies, and also a very interesting predictive problem where we're using network structures to predict important financial outcome.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining this session. Yeah, I think you can see my screen. So basically, in the last, I don't know, half hour, 40 minutes, I think Prasanta did a fantastic job in motivating why you want to use networks. At least I'm super convinced. Well, I was already super convinced before the session, but still, I think it was a very good summary on why you would want to use networks. So now, where I want to pick this up is, if you already decided that you want to use networks, what should be your next step? And my totally unbiased opinion is that, well, you should download Lynx Guide. So what is Lynx Guide? Basically, Lynx Analytics is a consultancy, like a data analytics consultancy specialized in network analytics. And we first implemented Lynx Guide as an internal tool because we had trouble executing our network analytics projects. It was just no good tool available to be able to efficiently and conveniently do graph analytics and do this graph-centric data mining. And by now it grew into a pretty comprehensive tool which can cover like the whole spectrum of a graph machine learning project. And this June we just open sourced the whole thing. So we are super excited to put it in the hands of data scientists, and I really hope some of you will find this useful. So to convince you about my biased opinion, I'm going to show you a little bit of use case. But before that, maybe a little bit more about this slide. So what is Lynx-Kite? If I want to define Lynx-Kite in one sentence, I usually compare it to some other tools. Like I'm sure many of you know tools like RapidMiner or SPSS Modeler or all those traditional data mining tools, which allows the data scientists to very efficiently and iteratively work on certain data mining problems. So Lynx-Kite is the same, except all those things that travel between the nodes of your workflow are not tables, as in those traditional tools, but they are graphs. So Lynx-Kite is basically a graph data mining tool. Yeah, it can import data, make them into graph, run various graph algorithms, build complex pipelines out of these graph algorithms, look at the data at various ways, and also combine with other tools outside of Lynx-Kite, including code-related stuff like notebooks or just data-driven integration. I will also show that a little bit. So without further ado, let me show you. So okay, so this is Lynx-Kite. I already opened a project called Meetup Demo, and what you will see soon is that we are going to build a workflow out of boxes. These boxes are basically representing some operations. But what we are starting with here, what I already put on, is 2 import boxes. I just dropped 2 CSV files into the workspace. And this is the data we are going to talk about in the next, I don't know how many minutes. Basically, what we start with is a very simple price time information. Like we have here the S&P 500 stocks. And for every day, for I think almost a 10-year period, we basically have the closing prices of those particular stocks. There is another table I'm going to use, which is basically just some metadata. So out of these S&P tickers, we know the name of the company and the sector. So first, I really want to give the message that creating a graph in Lynx-Kite is super easy if you actually have a graph. Like for example, if you have a transaction network, you really just put in one box and you have the network as a graph. Now, in this case, the graph is not trivial. I'm still going to show you one very simple one. Like if you look again at this table, like we can create a graph out of the companies and the sectors. It's not going to be an interesting graph, but just to show you how simple it is. Like basically there is this build graph operations. I say use a table as a graph. I link this thing in here. And all I have to tell Lynx-Kite is which columns in this table, which I show you again, should be used as the source and destination IDs for the edges. So for source ID, I'm going to use, let's say, the name of the company, and for destination, I'm going to use the sector. So now we end up with a graph with, I don't know, 500 vertices and roughly 500 edges. It's a very, very boring graph. Nevertheless, I'm going to show you. It's basically like what you see here is that there is this XLAM Incorporated, and this company is in the industrial sector. So we have an edge from this guy to this category. I can walk around in this view, so I can say that now we see all the vertices which are connected to this guy, which is just one, like every company is in a single sector. But if I choose this to be the center, then I get just a little bit more interesting visualization. So now I basically see all the companies in this graph which are in this industries sector. So again, this is a very boring graph. I'm not going to talk anything more about that. Like the only reason I showed this is that this is that easy in Lynx-Kite, like just one box. If you have some sort of already graph data, you can very easily get it in and do all the stuff that I'm going to do in the future. But what we are going to do now is a little bit more involved. We are going to actually create a graph from this table. And the way we are going to do it is we are going to look at the correlation. We are going to link 2 symbols if their day-by-day price is very correlated. Like when one moves up, the other also moves up. To do that, I'm actually going to use some Python code, which is also fairly important notion. Then in Lynx-Kite, usually you can do everything by just putting boxes next to each other and selecting some parameters. But if you do want to do something custom and something special, then you can always do the advanced stuff, like easy things are easy and hard things are possible, because you can always literally use Python, and whatever library is available in Python is available for you in Lynx-Kite. So what happens in this particular case, I'm just very briefly showing this code, not going into the details. Like you can read in this GitHub project a lot of detail about how to do these correlation networks. This is basically a simplified version of the code explained here. But what happens is basically we are loading this price data, we are cleaning it up a little bit, throwing away duplicates, and then there is the most critical line. Here we compute some sort of a normalization, and we are removing time balance. But at the end of the day, all we do is we are doing a Pearson correlation, totally standard NumPy pandas code. There is nothing Lynx-Kite specific or nothing too crazy about that. We really end up with a matrix where every two ticker has a correlation number. And then what we do here, we just iterate over all the members of this matrix. And if the correlation is bigger than 0.7, then we are outputting an edge. Basically, we are outputting the source index, the destination index, and the correlation of that particular pair. And given this, basically here we are just generating a list of these edge data, and I'm outputting this to Lynx-Kite as the edge data. So how to take this code from our Emacs to Lynx-Kite? Well, I'm going to just copy paste. There is a box here in Lynx-Kite, which is in the build graph category. We are going to create a graph in Python. Basically, I just copy the code here. There is one more thing I have to say, is that I have to specify the schema of this graph. Like what are the edge and vertex attributes that are being generated by this Python code. Let me also copy paste that too, just to make sure I'm not wasting too much time with writing text. So after these two parameters, what comes out of this box is already a graph. Like we have these 505 vertices, which is exactly the number of the S&P 500 stocks. And we see the metadata here. So 500 vertices, around 2000 edges. And on each vertex, we have this ticker as a vertex attribute. So every vertex has the symbol, and on the edges, there is a correlation number. So in the end, if you can also see that the range of this is going from 0.7 to almost 1, which is expected because we were thresholding at 0.7. So we only kept the strongly correlated pairs of tickers. So one more thing I'm going to do, I want to use the sector property here. So I'm going to merge this on my graph. There is an operation called useTable as vertex attributes. All I do is that I say that on this graph, I want to put the data from this table, and I have to explain like what is the ID attribute in the graph, which I can use to connect to what ID attribute in the table. And that's it. After this operation, I have a more rich graph. You see, I have 3 more vertex attributes, which were coming from the table. So at this point, it's probably time to actually look at our graph. So we are not very lucky. This is a very boring vertex. It doesn't even have any neighbors. The fact that I just see this vertex around means that the system automatically picked the vertex, which doesn't even happen to have any edges. But good thing I can, of course, choose which vertex I want to see. I'm going to look at this particular guy with the arrow K ticker. So now we have at least something. So there is this guy that I chose. This circle around it means that this is a center. So we are looking at all the neighbors of this guy. And these are the neighbors. Of course, I can't understand anything of this graph. So we need to put some attributes onto the visualization. I'm going to put name as a label and also maybe sector as a color on this visualization. So at this point, we see all the companies. So Rockwell Automation Incorporated is highly correlated with Amazon, Eaton, Dover, those guys here. And actually everybody is in the same sector. Like this is going to be a very prevailing thing that yes, of course, companies in the same sector tend to be very correlated. So what I can do, I can add some more centers. So let's see, I also want to see the neighbors of Honeywell. So I add him to the centers. So now I get a bunch of more industrials companies, but now actually we have a connection in materials, which again makes sense. Like, of course, materials and industries are very correlated. And if I add this guy as well, then I actually get a bunch of companies which are also in the material space. So remember, when creating the graph, we didn't use the sectors at all. This is all just correlation. But yeah, obviously correlations and sectors are very related to each other. So okay, this is our graph. As a next step, let's do something that Prasanta suggested us to do. Let's look at Centrality Matrix. It's again super easy in Lynx. Like we have a lot of graph computations available. I can just pull in like, okay, I want to compute PageRank. I also want to compute, say, centrality. And I also want to compute, degree. And maybe let's also compute clustering coefficient. So these are all the operations you can do in Lynx, and it's categorized. So one way to do it is just look at the category. Actually, when you get more experience, you usually prefer this one. Like if I start writing clustering coefficient, then it finds the box for me. So all of these boxes have parameters. Like for example, in PageRank, I can set up quite a few stuff, but I think the defaults are fine for me. Same thing for centrality. I even have a few different algorithms, but I'm just going to stick with the defaults now. And so at the end of the day, like after running all these operations, we have an even richer graph. Like we have a bunch of more vertex attributes, centrality, clustering coefficient, degree, PageRank, were added by these boxes. So let's take a look. Like what I can now do is take this same visualization box. I was just copy pasting this box here. Let's take a look again. And let's put let me make it a little bit bigger. Let's put the stuff on it. So for example, if I put PageRank, which I didn't want as a label, let's put the size and keep name as a label. You can see that these more central things like this Honeywell, which led us to the other category, Illinois, are a little bit bigger. So they are more central nodes according to PageRank. And here as well, like this PPG is a relatively central nodes. Those are a little bit less. The other one, just back. So the other that I find pretty interesting is actually clustering coefficient. So what clustering coefficient means is how connected your neighborhood is. So basically your clustering coefficient is high if all your friends know each other. Your clustering coefficient is low if you have a lot of connections in different groups. Like in this visualization, you can see that actually these two guys have the lowest clustering coefficient, which makes sense because they are not only connected to the same clique of companies like this within industrial or him within materials, but they are also connected cross to each other, and that's why that clustering coefficient is low. Okay, so what I can also do is actually just take a look. Let me create another visualization. where I literally just look at the whole graph. To do that, I can say that I actually want to see all vertices. So this is not a very typical way to look at the graph, actually, because most of the graphs are just way too big to do that. But luckily for us, it's a fairly small graph, just 500-ish vertices. We can actually visualize it like that. You can see that there are these groups and these denser areas in the graph, which is made clear by the visualization, which tries to locate vertices in a way that edges are as short as possible. It's basically like a spring simulation based layout. If I put again sector as a color on the vertices, then again we can see that these things are highly correlated with the sector. So yeah, we have the real estate guys here, and there are some consumer discretionary guys here. What is also noteworthy here is that the financials are actually in the thick part of the graph, but they are kind of spread all over the place, which makes sense because, of course, financial companies are connected to all the rest of the economy. And we can see that with the 0.7 threshold, we were not so unlucky to pick a vertex at the beginning, which has no neighbors. Like there are a lot of these isolated vertices, which are not correlated to any other ticker at this particular threshold. So this is nice. We have a sort of overview of our graph. What we can also do is to try to concentrate on the important vertices in this graph. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm just making a copy of this visualization. I do everything as before. Okay. But I'm actually interested only in the important vertices, like which are the important vertices in this graph and how are they connected to each other. So what I'm going to do is I put a filter here. I say that I only want to see guys which have a page rank higher than 2.5. If I do this, then of course I have a very, very different picture. And now it makes sense to put on the names, because in the previous one there were too many vertices to make sense of them. But now we can see that, yeah, these are the most important vertices, and you can again see like this. Maybe the name is too much. Maybe let's put the ticker to keep it a little bit more visible. So again, you can see that the most important vertices are typically again clustered around sectors, and yeah, it's also interesting that the highest page rank ones are of course the financial guys. But energy is also high page rank. Utilities is another group of high page rank vertices, and so on. So one last way that we can look at the graph. So I told earlier that this full graph visualization is usually worthless. It's just simply, even if your browser and CPU can handle the load, your brain cannot. Like if you see a hairball of 1 million vertices, it's not very useful. So there is another way to look at graphs, which we call the bucketed view. It's especially designed to to have an understanding of the total graph. So I switch over here to bucketed view. I will need to have a lot of buckets. And then first, let's see what we get now. Well, it's an extremely insightful visualization. Looking at this, you know everything about this graph. What is happening? Why am I saying it makes any sense? So what is happening is that all the vertices are clumped together into a bucket. And what we visualize is how the edges go among the buckets. Now there is only one bucket, so of course all the edges go from this bucket to this same bucket. There is nothing we learned. But what we can do is tell Lynx to split up this bucket based on various attributes. So what I'm going to tell it first is that, okay, let's actually use page rank to split up this bucket. Now it's getting more interesting. So what we see is that most of the guys, 311 guys, have very low page rank. These are probably most of the isolated points. There are some very high page rank guys, but the majority of the connections actually belong to these guys with the PageRank around 2. Like you can see that these very thick arrow shows that most of the connections in the graph goes between 2 vertices within this PageRank zone. What I can also do is add another attribute on the Y degree. Now we also see that yes, surely, like as expected, degree and PageRank are correlated. Like if you have high degree, you tend to have higher PageRank. But of course, these are not the same metrics. Like you can see that this is just a correlation, but not an equality. It's also possible maybe instead of PageRank, let's put on centrality. Now this is an interesting one. Like it turns out that if we segment our graph based on centrality, then we even discover like 2 connected components. Like these 2 guys, like the vertices here and the vertices here, are either not connected at all, or maybe connected with some very, very few number of edges. So we actually end up with a low centrality cluster in our graph and the high centrality cluster. We can actually investigate this, and of course, it again turns out that certain industries tend to be low centrality guys, and other industries belong here. But it's kind of a way that like interesting insights can come out with looking at this kind of visualization. Okay. Now we looked at individual vertices, and actually this is the point where I can connect back to Marco's question. Like, does it make sense to try to compress the graph as he said it? Like how we call it is basically merging certain vertices. And what I'm going to do here is merging the vertices by industry. So I want to match by sector, and I can also compute some aggregated attributes. Like we definitely want the count of symbols, like how many companies are belonging to a certain sector, and we can compute, let's say, the average of our centrality matrix. And let's see what we get at the end. So now, as a result of this box, we go from a 500 vertex graph to an 11 vertex graph. And let's look at it. We have only 11 vertices. Let us show them all. And yeah, let me do the usual stuff of putting the sector as a label, maybe also as a color. So now we see basically a graph on our sectors. Like what is, of course, the first thing is that sure, all the edges, like almost all the edges are actually within sectors. So in this correlation level, most of the correlation go within sector, and there are a few weak edges that go cross these buckets. You can also look at, like, I don't know, maybe if I use clustering coefficient average as a color, then we can also see stuff that which are the industries which tend to have high clustering coefficient vertices, which are the industries that tend to have very low clustering coefficient industries. It's actually, again, very along our intuition. Like financials have very low clustering coefficient, which means that financial institutions' neighborhoods are less like cliques, which means that yes, financial institutions tends to have friends in very different kind of cliques or communities. All right, so this is one way. Actually, I want to show another way to cut up our graph. So now we actually use an existing attribute that is a very good categorization for the graph. But what we can do is we can also ask Lynx to figure out the groups themselves based on just the structure. There are actually different ways to do that, but the one I'm wanting to show with modular clustering. So what modular clustering does, I don't even have to do much. Maybe, okay, I can use correlation as a weight attribute. I don't say anything about attributes here. We are really just using the graph structure. And what is happening is that Lynx tries to create clusters which are as little connected to each other and as much connected to themselves via edges. As a result of this operation, we have a new thing here called the segmentation. So what is a segmentation? It is what it sounds like. Basically, all vertices of the graph are now put into these groups, which are called modular clusters. And we can see some basic statistics. So we actually ended up with lots of modular clusters, and they are covering the whole base. Like every single vertex is in one of these clusters. Why do we have so many modular clusters? Of course, because of those insane number of isolated vertices. So if I look at the histogram of the size of these clusters, I see that most of these, actually 319 out of the modular clusters, are at most 3 large. Those are not very interesting clusters. So what I'm going to do is to filter out the small one. We have a filter by attributes operation. And I'm actually don't want to filter the main graph, but I want to filter the modular clusters. And I only want to to keep those where the size is larger than 4. If I look at the graph after this one, I end up with only 8 modular clusters, now a much more healthier size distribution. So again, let's take a look at that. So as usual, we want all. Yeah, so these are all the modular clusters. Now I forgot to do one thing. There are no edges. Like we don't have edges between the clusters. These are just blobs, just sets. I can actually, like the one thing I can do is I can put the size of these. Now I see that, okay, there are bigger sets and there are smaller sets, but this is not what I wanted to show you. I do want edges. Luckily, there is an operation which takes the edges from the original graph and pushes it forward to a segmentation. What it means, if there is an edge between 2 points, then we add an edge between the segments of those points. So if I do this, I tell it to do it on modular clusters, then finally we have edges. And again, of course, like in this graph, it was easy, but Lynx did an almost perfect job. Like all these things are not only modular clusters, but mostly connected components. Like there are absolutely no edges, except in some rare condition. So now what might be interesting, and this is the last thing I do in the visualization world, is these automatically found clusters. How do they relate to the sectors that we knew from the start? To do that, actually, let me combine these two things, like this path here and this. It's actually super easy. Like all I do, I just change the routing here, which is actually shows how easy it is to play around with stuff in Lynx. So now I do all this modular clustering stuff before I'm merging the vertices by the sector. So now what we end up with is a graph where the base graph has 11 vertices. They are all categorized into these modular clusters, which I have 8 of. And interestingly, they are, of course, covering these vertices multiple times. It's better to show it than to explain. So this is just the left side, the base graph. But what I'm going to do now is add to the visualization the modular clusters. And I not only want, so this is just one of the clusters. Let me add all of them. And here we are. So basically what you see here is that the automatically found clusters are very often almost one-on-one correspond to a sector. But in some cases, it's not exactly what's happening. Like this guy is actually a shared cluster between materials and industrials. And this is actually a pretty mixed one among different categories, which shows that actually there are more here than just what is determined by the by the sectors of these companies. One more thing I quickly wanted to show, because this is a bit lame that these are just these uniform blue balls. I would like to label those, but how could I label those? I mean, they don't have any intrinsic property of, these are just modules which are found based on the graph structure. So what I'm going to do is to try in each of these group, find a company which is somehow representative of that group. So what I would like to do is that each of these blobs should be labeled by the company which has the highest page rank within this group. You can also do that in Lynx. So there is a weighted aggregate to segmentation operation. I'm going to do this here. So what I want to do, I want to work again on the modular clusters segmentation, and I want to take the page rank as the so-called weight, which isn't really going to be a weight in our case, as you will see in a second. And then I want to take the name of the company by max weight. So what it means that each group has multiple companies. I want Lynx to choose the one company with the highest page rank, and for that company, take the name into the segmentation. So the result of this is this in the modular clusters, we now have this somewhat ugly named attribute, name by max weight by page rank. This is really just name of companies. So every single modular cluster is now labeled by the name of a company. So with that, I can make this visualization a little bit prettier. I can put this new label on my visualization. And yeah, why not put the size also, so that we see how big are all those modular clusters. So now we indeed see that, okay, for example, this modular cluster, which is very much in line with the financials, is dominated by T row price, which is not very surprising. And I mean, all those other companies, I don't know much, but yeah, sure. Noble Energy sounds like an energy company, apparently an important one if we look at stock correlation. So, okay, I think that's about the exploration, like how you can take a graph and with Lynx very easily generate a lot of different properties, graph metrics, and look at it and get insights. Oh, actually, one more thing which I wanted to show, which is also a very, very cool feature. Like if I look, let's say this is our ultimate visualization. It's pretty and everything, but what if I want to look at this same visualization using a different threshold? Like remember at the very, very beginning in the code, there was this 0.7. Why is it 0.7? Why did I threshold at 0.7? Honestly, I have no idea. It just gave a reasonable amount of edges, which is easy to work with. But let's see what happens if I change this threshold here. And I literally just go in the box, change this threshold, and now everything is recomputed. So all the boxes that we did at the beginning is now recomputed using the new graph, and we end up with a very different visualization. You see, if the threshold is done differently, then all the edges are within sectors is not really true anymore. Like you see that there are very strong correlation among these different sectors. Still, actually, the modular clusters are pretty good at capturing big parts of certain sectors. So of course, it's still true that edges correlate with sectors, but it's not so black and white picture anymore. That almost all edges are within sectors. Okay, let's go back to 0.7, and the last thing I want to show is okay, all this is very nice to look at graph. It's pretty and everything, and it's a pleasure to to play around with Lynx kite, add different parameters, try different ways. But what if we actually want to use these attributes to something useful, like maybe some prediction problem? So until now, I built this workspace one by one just to show how easy it is. But now I'm going to copy in a bit more complex workspace. Basically, every workspace section you have can be copy-pasted as a YAML file. So what I have here in my Emacs is really a textual representation of a Lynx kite workspace. So again, what I'm going to do, and to generate something like that, you just select a few boxes and press Ctrl+C. What I'm going to do is now the opposite. I take this YAML, put it on my clipboard, and I can copy this in here. So what is going to happen in this workspace is a little bit of modeling. Let me show you. First of all, I have to connect in the graph we created here. And now we should be all set. We are going to start again with the table at the beginning. Like every company, we have a date, we have a price. But we want to do something very simple. This is really just for demonstration purposes and to vet your appetite to maybe do the same analysis in a bit more sophisticated way. I'm going to look at this table and take the price value from these 3 specific dates. Just 3 beautiful days from July 2017. I take them as price 1, price 2, price 3. And I'm also computing these deltas. It's basically like a percentage difference in the price. Delta 1 is between the 10s and the 11s. And there is also delta 2, which is just the change between 11s and 12s. So the result is, it's an SQL. So I'm still having a table. Basically, every stock, we have these 3 prices, we have the deltas. Now, as I did before, I'm taking those things in using this, let me zoom in a little bit, using these use table as vertex attributes. Now I have the same graph we had until now, but with all these numbers on it. There is one more thing I do. I'm actually computing what is the average data in the second day. Like what I really want to do, and I think I forgot to say this, is to predict this data too. Like, can we somehow say something about how all of these stocks move? And when I look at this data too, it can be seen that actually it's a little bit biased. So the market was having a good day, apparently. I can also see this as by computing the average here of the data. As a result of this operation, I see that actually the average change in the stocks was 0.68%, which is actually a pretty significant uptick in the S&P 500. So to make the prediction task more interesting, I'm not going to try to predict which stocks moved up or down, but I want to predict which stocks moved up above average and which stocks moved down above average. So it's very simple. I'm just deriving a new attribute, like I'm basically changing data 2. So the new data 2 is going to be simply the old data 2 minus the average. With this, we have a much more balanced distribution. So now this is much more around 0. I'm throwing away the very extreme ones, just normal outlier detection. So if somebody moves more than 5%, I just don't care about those. Actually, I'm dropping a surprising, it's not the only thing I throw away, sorry. I throw away the ones where the movement is too much, but I also throw away those where degree is 0. Like the reason I do this is that I'm interested in the graph-based prediction. So I just throw away those isolated points from the graph. I don't care about that for this demonstration. So I end up with 180 stocks. All those have a reasonable amount of movement, and they are also part of the graph. And then I finally derive the target attribute that I want to predict. It's very simple. If delta 2 is bigger than 0, so it means that the stock moved up more than average, then it goes up, otherwise not. Our task is to try to predict this attribute. So first off, standard data science stuff. I'm splitting the goes up attribute into a test and training set. So the result of this is that instead of having a goes up attribute, which is defined on 180 points, I have a goes up test, which is defined on 39 cases, and the goes up train, which is defined on the rest. I'm totally usual stuff. I can only use the training in training, and I'm going to compute precision on the test set. So let's just first do the most trivial thing that comes to mind. Let's train a linear regression based on the previous day's data. Like I look at what happened yesterday. Based on that, can a linear regression tell me whether we are going to go up or not? And the answer is, not so surprisingly, is a no. Like we basically have a coin flip accuracy out of this model, which is of course not surprising at all. Like if you could tell the direction a stock moves just based on yesterday, then none of us would be sitting here. We would be already crazy rich and sitting on the Bahamas. So it doesn't work. What is more surprising is that the next one actually does. So what I do here is that instead of just using the previous day, I drop into the linear regression model all these graph centrality metrics that we computed here. So we still keep yesterday's price, but we add in centrality, clustering coefficient, degree, and page rank as parameters. And if I do the model with this, we get a significantly higher accuracy. Of course, this is an extremely hard task. Like predicting where a stock goes is super difficult. So having this accuracy, actually, I was very surprised when I see this. So of course, it's not a readily applicable thing. Like it's not like tomorrow I'm going to I don't know, give my notice at Lynx Analytics and start predicting stocks because we do cheat a little bit. Like of course it's enough if we can observe something that on this particular day, nodes with high page rank tends to trend up, because we use the training set on that particular day to predict the same day for different stocks. But it's still, I think it's extremely interesting that you can learn this kind of thing, that on that particular day we are investigating, actually some of these graph centrality metrics is helpful in predicting the direction a stock goes. So the next line here, nothing too exciting, but just wanted to show off like that we are still within Lynx kite. You can easily do some more stuff. It's like, okay, I can use a decision tree instead of a logistic regression. Yes, in fact, the result is even better than the previous. Now we are at 72% accuracy. And finally, what you can do is do something even more sophisticated, although the results are going to be a little bit weaker, is to do a GCN classifier. Like in this case, we are using a graph convolutional network, which is a neural network model designed exactly to capture the structure and capture the information flow within a graph. So if we are using a GCN classifier, it's very easy in Lynx-Kite. You just drop in this box. We are creating here some features, like we create a feature vector from the very same attributes than before. We throw it into this train GCN box, but you can see there are a bunch of hyperparameters here, which is like, yeah, always the drawback of a more complex method. And then we get another prediction using GCN. Actually, this is worse than the decision tree, but to tell the truth, I didn't spend much time trying to get this great. Probably if you tune this right, it could take over. The point is really that we are still within Lynx-Kite, and you can play around with all these classical metric techniques, and even these more sophisticated graph-based machine learning are at your fingertips. But I know that most of you are probably doing way more sophisticated models than what I show here, and you probably already have your machine learning framework to work with. So in this case, it is actually worse to come to Lynx-Kite, generate a lot of different graph-related metrics, and then you can literally just export this data and then get it into your favorite machine learning framework. So basically what you can do is I can just put in an SQL box. Let's say here is my graph. I'm actually going to just keep all attributes from the vertices, and I can export it to, depending on what's your favorite format. Okay, I can export to CSV. I guess that works with everybody. Actually, I can export this into an HDFS file system or local file system, or I can just download it, and then yes, I just push this export button, and all the data is generated in a CSV file. And then you can use these metrics in whatever machine learning library you prefer, or whatever framework you are already using for classical machine learning. Maybe one more thing to add, which, exactly because of Marco's question, we actually have this embedding operation. So let me see if this works. So again, of course, a lot of things. It's basically a node-to-vec implementation within Lynx. Like what node-to-vec means is that you take a graph and you try to find coordinates in a high-dimensional space, which makes it so that vertices with similar role in the network are close to each other in this embedding. So
just a question, Andreas.
Yep.
So this embedding, for now, as I understand, we have only structural features of the graph. But if we would have like attributes, does the embedding can embed like any kind of features, both structural features and attribute features?
So that's a good question. So the short answer is probably no. So this operation only uses the structure.
Okay.
But depending on the kind of attribute, you might be able to cheat. Like it's very often possible to convert an attribute into some kind of a graph. Like for example, at the very beginning, what I did is that instead of having the sector as an attribute, you can have the sector as vertices connected to the other vertices in that sector. If you do this kind of stuff, then you actually encode the attribute into the graph structure, and then of course the embedding is going to take that into account. Also, there are other embedding techniques which are not readily available as a box in Lynx-Kite, but you can basically very easily use Python geometric from Lynx-Kite, and then some of those would actually support it. Like you would have to write a little bit of Python code, but it's made very streamlined. So anyhow, let's see what happens with these vector attributes. So yeah, here we get an array. I'm not sure what happens in the CSV file, but basically you can definitely export into a Parquet file. Maybe it also works with CSV. I haven't tried. But basically here you have an embedding of the vertex, and this is very well suited to be used in a downstream machine learning algorithm. Okay, I think that's what I had planned for the demo. Any questions?